Hey everyone, my name is Jillian Amodio, and I am a licensed social worker, a sex therapy informed professional, and a psychology professor. And I'm here today to talk with you about reclaiming joy and sensuality when we have faced sexual repression and sexual shame. So I'd like to start with a little story. When I was 12 years old, I had my first suicidal ideation. And I had this suicidal ideation about 10 minutes after walking out of confession. And I grew up in a very loving home. I lived with my grandparents. I absolutely adored them. But I grew up in a very strict Catholic home. And there were some things that I loved about my Catholic faith. I loved the predictability. I loved the hymns. I loved the traditions. But there were things that have, as I've grown, just not sat well with me. And on this day, when I was 12 years old and I walked into confession, I was so excited because this was a special confession. Not only were my active sins, the sins that I had actually committed, going to be forgiven this day, but also my my innate sin, my original sin, the sin that I was born with just by being human, were going to be forgiven as well. And what that meant in my Catholic faith was that if I were to die, and my soul was clean not only of my active sin, but also my original sin, I would not have to go in purgatory, and I would just ascend straight into heaven and live out the rest of my eternal existence with Jesus and the angels and God, and it was going to be beautiful. And as a child, I struggled immensely with feelings of guilt and shame over pretty much anything you could name. So this idea was very comforting to me that I, on this day, could clean my soul so well that I would be free from sin forever and go to heaven. Now, the caveat was I had to remain free from sin. So I confessed my sins, and I even confessed to the priest that I had seen pornography. At the ripe old age of 12, I had seen pornography. Now, what did that pornography mean? Well, the day before, my grandma had taken me to the mall, and we had walked through the Macy's department store, and I happened to, as we were walking, look to my left, and we were near the men's underwear aisle, and I had seen the pictures on the men's underwear packaging, and to me, that was pornography. So that was just one of the sins that I confessed that day. So I walked out of confession, and of course I was feeling a little embarrassed, a little awkward, still a little bit ashamed, but I kept telling myself, no, the shame is gone. You are clean, you are free, this is wonderful. I knelt on the pews, I pulled out my rosary, and I said my entire rosary as my penance. And when I walked out those doors, I was feeling free, I was feeling relaxed, I was feeling completely empowered and ready to live the rest of my life completely sin-free. And then all of a sudden, my 12-year-old brain reminds me, girl, you're only 12 years old. How are you going to go the rest of your life without committing a sin? And I thought, oh my goodness, you're right. You can't possibly go the rest of your life without committing a sin. That's just not possible. So I looked out, and there was a highway in front of our church, and I thought, well, if I run in front of those cars that are going 55, 60 miles an hour, I will get hit by the car, I will immediately die, and in this state of purity and cleanliness, I will immediately send to heaven. Problem solved. Great, great idea. And then another thought entered my mind. Wait. Suicide's a sin. So immediately, there went my plan, right? And all of that familiar shame and guilt started coming back up again. Here we are, 10 minutes out of confession, and you're already thinking these sinful thoughts. And now we're hopeless again because you wasted this beautiful opportunity. You're already a sinner. Here we go. Back to square one. So this state of fear and shame and panic really traveled with me throughout childhood and into adolescence. And one of the biggest factors related to this sense of shame I felt was discomfort and fear surrounding the theme of sex and sexuality. Now, another thing about my very Catholic upbringing was that I knew on a surface level that things like sex were bad. And we didn't talk about sex. We didn't talk about how babies were born. We didn't talk about kissing. We didn't talk about masturbation. We didn't talk about any of that. I knew those terms existed, but I had no actual understanding of what those things meant. And to children, the unknown is often more scary than the known. So to me, these were big secrets, and these were terrible things that I knew nothing about, that I knew I was supposed to avoid, but I didn't know what they meant. So how was I supposed to not have sex if I didn't know what it was? How was I supposed to not masturbate if I didn't know what it was? How was I supposed to not have an abortion if I didn't know what it was? How was I supposed to not be gay if I didn't know what it was, right? All of these things that kept going through my head. So as I moved into puberty, I began to panic even more because I began to hear all of my friends and my peers talking about boys and crushes and who they wanted to kiss. And I was like, oh my gosh, I don't think we're supposed to do that. I don't want to get caught up in any of that. But then these new fears started to emerge. And I was like, oh my gosh, what if I'm doing these things and I don't even know what they are? So I was supposed to kiss a boy in a school play. And in my head, I thought, well, that might be sex. I don't know. I don't know if that's sex or not, but I shouldn't do that because that's a sin. And so he ended up just holding his hand instead. But even that made me so uncomfortable because I thought maybe that was a sin. So I cried on stage. Another boy ended up asking me to the school dance. And I thought, well, is being desired by a boy bad? Is that the same as being like a slut or impure? And I got so nervous and didn't know what to do, so I threw up on his shoes. And when I threw up on his shoes, he didn't want to go to the dance with me anymore. So I said, all right, well, I guess I avoided that. Then came my menstrual cycle, and my family had signed me out of our sex education class in school. They said we were going to learn about that at home, but unfortunately, we never quite got around to learning about that at home. So by the time I had my menstrual cycle, I thought I was dying. And I was in my middle school bathroom and I was sobbing on the bathroom floor. And I truly thought that I was such a sinful being that my body was giving up. My body was getting rid of this lifeblood inside of me. I no longer deserved to be alive. And I was like panicking and thinking, how much longer do I have to live? Can I get to confession again? Can I confess all of my sins so that I don't die in a state of sin? And then another student walked in and they were like, I don't know what this chaos and turmoil is, but I'm going to go get the school nurse. And the school nurse came down and explained that, well, I was just becoming a woman. So, okay, I might not be dying, but I was becoming a woman. What did that mean? Well, women were supposed to grow up. They were supposed to get married. They were supposed to have babies, but I didn't know how to do any of that. I didn't know when to do any of that. I didn't know how babies were born, but I thought it had something to do with sex, and I was really confused because sex was also bad. And all of this shame just kept spiraling into this massive ball of anxiety that at 13 years old was just too much to cope with. And again, I found myself suicidal. So as I continued this silent journey into emotional turmoil, my depression got worse and worse. And I began to hate my body because people were starting to notice my body. Boys were starting to notice my body. I was starting to develop a more womanly figure. And to me, that also meant that I was shameful and I was a temptation, and that was all bad. And I didn't want to be any of those things, but I also didn't know how to not be any of those things. And what's clear to me as an adult now that wasn't clear to me as a child is that the cure to anxiety is often knowledge. And had I known and understood what sex was and what sexuality was, and what healthy relationships looked like with yourself and others, that anxiety probably would have been quelled and quieted. But because I was working with limited knowledge, I had nothing to calm my fears with. And as I continued through high school, things only got more challenging. My peers were starting to date, and I was really confused because I wasn't feeling the same way they were. I wasn't feeling drawn to boys. I didn't have an interest or a desire. And so then this other terrifying thought entered my head: what if I'm gay? Well, I was being told that being gay was a sin at the time. So that terrified me. And then eventually I also endured a sexual assault. And unfortunately, I didn't have the language I needed to explain what had happened. And when I tried to explain what had happened, a caregiver, a close adult, told me, "You're a whore, and I hope you get pregnant." And again, this was just more sexual shame and misinformation being implanted in my brain and taking root in my psyche. And it really confused me as a growing woman. I felt like I had no place in the world. I felt like no matter what I did, I was wrong, I was sinful, I was shameful, I was gross, I was dirty, I was broken, I was damaged, and my depression got worse and worse. And I began cutting and I began contemplating suicide even more seriously. And it was a really challenging time. I did eventually meet a boy in high school. We ended up having sex, and I didn't really even know we had sex because I didn't quite know what it was, but I kind of figured it was wrong. But because I'd done it once, I guess I was going to do it more. And long story short, it was just a very chaotic introduction to what sexual shame can do if it's not confronted. As I grew up, as I grew into an adult, I did get married. I have two children who I love dearly, but I began to branch out in my spiritual belief systems. And I think a lot of my personal growth, or I know a lot of my personal growth, actually happened when I went away to grad school. Well, when I got my bachelor's degree, and then I went away to grad school and I got my master's degree in social work. And this is really where my worldview started to open up. And I was becoming introduced to so many things and so many different forms of thought and schools of thought and ideas and lifestyles that I'd never been introduced to before. And what I found was that the more knowledge I gained, the more clarity I gained. And I started to distance myself from organized religion and found myself drawn more to spirituality. And in that journey of transitioning from a very rigid and structured and rule following religion to this more free form representation of spirituality where I was being guided by intuition and love and compassion and connection, I really started to reshape my relationship with myself. And the further I went into my higher education, the deeper I got involved in LGBTQ studies and the deeper I got involved into sexuality studies. And that became kind of my area of focus. And that's what I want to pass along to us today. Because in my clinical practice, in my clinical work, when I'm working especially with women or couples or trauma victims or people who've escaped religious abuse or cult affiliations, or people who have experienced sexual assault, when I'm working with teenagers who are, starting to come into their sense of sexuality and they have questions and they want to know about safe and healthy relationships and they have questions about their identity, I find that it is important to have knowledge, but it's also important to have permission to just explore and to honor who we are at our core. And I think the first thing that we need to remember is that we are all human and we're all learning, and learning is such a beautiful part of human existence. We don't have to know the right answer to everything. We are meant to experience life and to learn from each situation. So I have 5 grounded, trauma-informed, empowering tips where we can kind of focus our attention when we're having this conversation on growing from sexual shame and turning sexual shame into sexual empowerment. And the first step is to separate spirituality from sexual control. So many women have been taught that sexuality has to be managed, that it has to be moral, that maybe the only purpose of sexuality is to find a hetero partner and to have children, and that's what sexuality is for. But sexuality is so much more than that. Sexuality is self-expression, and it's sensual, and it's connected innately to who we are at our core. And sexuality is not a threat to goodness. It's simply an expression of humanity. The second kind of tip I have is to reclaim your body as safe and not sinful. Religious shame often teaches us that we need to disconnect from sensations and from pleasure and from our body. And healing starts with a gentle reconnection. And this can be done by just noticing sensations on the body in general. What does it feel like to take a warm shower? What does it feel like to wear a soft sweater? What does it feel like to be hugged by someone you love? Our bodies are meant to experience sensation, both pleasurable and unpleasurable. I mean, we experience pain in life too, and pain has a purpose. It tells us, hey, we don't like this. This is unsafe. But our bodies are designed to experience pleasure, both sexual and just physical in nature. And so we need to reclaim our body as a safe vessel for pleasure. The third is to replace the idea of purity with consent and choice. Purity culture often skips the most important sexual value of all, which is agency and control. It's all about asking, what do I want? What feels good? What feels safe? What feels affirming? What feels like a hard no? And can I honor that no without guilt? Am I fully informed? Do I really know what's being asked of me or what I'm doing and its impact it has on me? Sexuality is all about safety in the form of choice, autonomy, boundaries, and trust. Trust with both ourselves and our partner or partners. So it's not about purity, it's about consent. The fourth tip, or the fourth kind of thing to think about, is we have to allow ourselves to have desire, and we have to allow ourselves to be curious. And that desire should be based on curiosity and not just goal oriented. So sexual desire, for instance, for those of us who feel that, sexual desire should be about curiosity. It should be about what is going to help me feel good right now, what is going to bring me closer to my partner or partners, what is going to help me feel connected, what is going to help me feel safe and comfortable. What am I curious about trying? What is holding me back from trying? And a goal-oriented approach to sexual desire is more about conception or pleasing others, and that's not the goal. Even in a consent-driven approach, the goal should not even be orgasm. The goal should be pleasure and connection, right? So instead of shifting, or instead of asking ourselves, what is the goal of my sexuality? Ask, what am I curious about with my sense of sexuality? Curiosity often softens shame, and exploring our sexual desire with curiosity encourages not only permission and autonomy, but also a sense of playfulness and growth. And then the fifth tip I have is it is okay to grieve what has been taken from you. Some of us feel, especially if we don't come into our sense of sexuality or our sense of comfort with our sexuality until later in life, we grieve what's been lost. And it is okay to grieve the loss and to grieve what could have been. And you can even say to yourself, I grieve the version of myself who was taught to not trust herself or to be ashamed of her body. And I'm reclaiming pleasure, presence, and ownership of my body, my sense of self, and my sexuality. And then I think the final thing I'd like to leave you with is just a framework or an approach to honoring your own sexuality and reclaiming the sexual joy and the comfort that can come with it. And I'd like to do this by offering you the word root, because I would like for this new approach to sexuality and self-love to be rooted deep within your soul. And root stands for release of shame. Let it go. The owning of your desire. Embrace it. The observation of sensation. What feels good. And trusting yourself. Know that you can lean on yourself and trust that you know what is right for you. So, I hope this was helpful and insightful. And for those of you who kind of know what I'm talking about, how it's really hard to grow from sexual shame, I want you to know that it can happen. It does happen. Growth is possible. And I want you to know that you deserve it.